Welcome to How to Write Good. I'm your host, Daniel Poppie. You can find out more about me at danielpoppie.com. Poppie is spelled P-O-P-P-I-E. At my website, you can find the first book in my adventure series. The book is called The Ninth Hour. I consider it a fantasy series, but if you read it, you probably won't. Otherwise, if you don't want to check that out, you can check out my serialized novel that is on my website and also on this podcast feed and its own podcast feed. So you don't even have to read it if you don't want to. You can just listen to it. That is called One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet. If you want to check it out in podcast form, all you need to do is go on any podcast app, type in that name, One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet. It'll pop up. Check those out both at my website, though, danielpoppie.com. We are going to jump into our word of the week. Our word of the week is melancholy, and melancholy is a feeling of pensive sadness, and it typically has no cause. So melancholy. It's actually a bit of an older word. It used to be used to describe depression. I think that you could still use it to describe depression. What was the guy's name? I believe that Lewis, as in Lewis and Clark, had depression, and when you look at his old journals or you look at things about him from the past, it described him as having melancholia, so which is a more archaic term, which is the same thing as depression, but they used to use that word instead of depression. So that's a newer word we use for the same exact thing. All right, moving on from that, we're going to jump into our accidental essence, and this is actually something that I think everybody who is a writer does this naturally. I think it's part of the process, and if you're going to be a writer, you're going to do this anyway. But I think it's something to think about, and it's something that I've talked about in the past to a certain degree, but I didn't understand it in the same way. So this is actually something I've been thinking about lately, and something that I've just been learning more about. I mean, is if you are thinking about something and you come to certain conclusions, does that count as learning about something? I'm not sure, but that's what I've been doing, and I've been listening, I guess, to other authors and other creative people and people who write stories or tell stories, and I've just been taking in what they say, and I've been determining what I think about that thing and whether I agree with it or not. But this is about characters, and I've actually stated in the past that I think the character is the central part of a story. And I think I still agree with that, and I think I agree with it more after thinking through what I've learned and thinking through the other ideas of other people, But I think about it in a different way. I do believe that you can't have a story. Like, a story isn't just characters, but characters are a vital part, and I think that the characters and who the characters are, how they're presented, the journey of those characters, because you don't have the journey of like an object, you have the actual journey of some character in some kind. Without that journey, without the characters themselves, you don't rise to the level of greatness in your stories. Now, I think it probably is a little bit presumptuous to be like, oh, this is what makes a great story or not, but I think that if you look at any really good story, you do have characters who not necessarily the reader connects with, but characters that are unique, characters that fit in the story, characters that are, without that character, the story wouldn't be the same thing. And yeah, if you replaced it with a different type of character, let's just say you replace it with a different stereotyped character, you might have a stereotyped character in the original story, but if you replace it with another stereotype, or a character like that, it might change the story completely. So if you have someone who's supposed to be a hero in the story, and you replace that hero with someone who is supposed to be, what would be another one? Would be like a lover, that's another stereotype, that's another archetype of a character. If you replace the hero with a lover, that's going to change the dynamic of the story completely, because that character is going to function differently in the story. But I am getting ahead of myself a little way. So I do think character is central to the story. I think that story revolves around character. I think that if you look at stories and how they're structured, the beginning of a story starts as a stasis, and then the character goes through a journey, and there's a new stasis. Okay, good stories, and I think that the majority of stories reach for this, but good stories start at a stasis, and the character changes, or if they don't, they do change in some way no matter what. I think that every story does have the character change in some way no matter what. But even if the character doesn't change or doesn't learn a lesson, they do change, they do react to what's going on, and you, the reader, see the character in a different light. So without that character, there can't be a character change. Therefore, you can't go from this one stasis to the new stasis at the end. Actually, for you, it's flipped. If I'm moving my hand. You can't go from one stasis to a different stasis at the end if you don't actually have a character, because you have that character change. And we always talk about this idea that, the character changed so much. One thing that when the, what is it called? When Breaking Bad existed, when it still exists, but when Breaking Bad started to come out, when it finally ended and they came to the end of the series, people were like, well, when people reviewed it, they're like, man, there's such a slow change. And he goes from this, if you haven't seen the show, it's, it has mature stuff in it. It's not for everybody. I'll say that. Some people don't like violence. Some people don't like. I guess it's a lot of violence, but your kids probably shouldn't watch it. But he goes from this really slow change at the beginning to this feeble. He's a weakling. He's a weakling at the beginning, and he turns into a criminal, a hardened criminal by the end of the series. Spoiler alert, retroactively. But yeah, so if you haven't seen it, watch it. It's worth it even knowing that. And I think that most people know that's what it is. But if he wasn't a weakling at the beginning and he didn't change to this hardened criminal by the end, there wouldn't be as much satisfaction. People wouldn't say that show is as good as it is. If you go from someone who, in the beginning of that show, he goes from someone who doesn't stand up for himself and his wife controls him, and he doesn't go out and try to do things for his life. He has kind of a crappy life. And then you go to someone, if you watch the show, you go to someone who's like, I'm the one who knocks on your door. I'm the danger. He's essentially saying he's the dangerous person. And that's a very different character by the end of the show. And there's a satisfaction in seeing that character change. And I think that I'm not going to spoil the end of the show if you haven't seen it, even though it's been out. I feel like it's been out like a decade by now. So you probably should see it if you have any interest. But when you get to the end of the show, I think a lot of people don't like the end of that show because of the fact that they like the character, even though he's an awful person by the end of the show. That happened in the show Dexter too. People don't like the character what happened to the character at the end of the show Dexter, which I think it was a good ending. I think it was a necessary ending. Okay, you don't just because you don't need a good emotion at the end of a story. I think that we've gotten so used to good emotions at the end of stories. Stories aren't meant to give you a good emotion, or stories aren't meant to show you that life turns out for the better in all cases. And in terms of Dexter, the show where the guy is a serial killer, the main character is a serial killer, which is fascinating. The ending of that show, I think they did the right choice. I think that was probably the best, and not probably the most realistic. Maybe not. The whole show is probably not very realistic. But if you want to if you want certain things to happen at the end of the show, if you don't want to just kill off the character, you have to end it in a certain way. So I guess I'm giving away a little bit of the ending of that show. I'm sorry for anybody who hasn't seen it. It's very bloody. It's very brutal. Let's just say that. That is another show where you probably don't want your kids watching it. And if you're a parent and your kids are watching that show under a certain age, you're probably a bad parent. Just saying. So I think that characters are at the core of good stories. But I don't think that stories are as simple as just characters. There's more going on. There's the structure of the story. There's how you write the story itself, the prose. And then there's a lot of moving parts. So I don't think it is as simple as just saying, you just have awesome characters and nothing happening. It can be pretty interesting if you just have characters, but it's not going to be. It's not really going to be a story if you don't have a story itself. But characters are vital, and I would say the central part of what that story is. You can use stock characters to write a story, but you're going to. It's just not going to be the same thing. You actually need those characters to be alive, to come alive to the people reading them, and it's not the same thing if you're just throwing in characters and not taking time on those characters and not taking thought, because it's not just time, it's thought as well. But yeah, my favorite parts of the stories are the characters, and I would say that if I asked anybody, if I said, "Oh, what's the thing you remember most about the stories you read? What's at the core of that experience?" You would probably say, "Hey, I like the characters the most, or I like what the characters do in that story, or I like what the characters say." In terms of going back to Breaking Bad, you have that quote, "I am the one who knocks," which is really satisfying, and you wouldn't have had the same satisfaction. You would have probably had some satisfaction if he just said it and he was like this really hardened character, and you're like, man, he's really cool. But at the same time, because you saw that journey of that character, when he gets to that point of saying that line, you're like, man, that's really cool. At the same time, you're like, man, he's really changed a lot since the beginning of the show. So I think that if you are honest, I think most people don't disagree with this, but if you look at shows, if you look at movies, you look at books, and you're like, man, what is your favorite part of those movies, those books, those shows, those stories? If we want to just lump them all together, I would say that most people center around characters, or they center around something directly related to the characters. This is why when you have disclaimer, I've never actually read it, but I've heard I don't want to bash it, but I probably should, just because it's fashionable, or it used to be fashionable. This is why when you had when Twilight was all the rage, you had people who were in the Edward camp and I don't know what the guy's name, Taylor Lautner or whatever his name is, that guy, the Edward and the what's his face camp. This happens in other areas too. They're like, oh, what team are you on? If there's like a rivalry, or there's two different, I think it's usually male characters. I don't think that it happens with female characters. For guys, I think it usually happens with male characters with girls more often. But it's like, oh, like we like this character better. I'm on team Edward. I don't know who the other character is. That's how much I know about that series. I've never read it. I'm probably never going to read it. I don't see the point. There was a lot of people who raved about it, but they were also 16-year-old girls. And I don't trust 16-year-olds, or I don't trust the majority of 16-year-olds with advice on what to read, unless I am 16. So you remember those characters, and people center themselves around those characters. What's the best part of Pirates of the Caribbean, or Pirates of the Caribbean, however you want to say it? I really don't care. The best part about that is the characters, and it's Johnny Depp's character. That's what it is. That's probably who you're going to remember. That's probably what you're going to remember. People watch those movies because Johnny Depp is in it, and he plays a really bizarre character. And Johnny Depp does this with the majority of his parts. They're very unique characters. There's characters that you remember, even though they're not necessarily the best. I think the Alice in Wonderland was a misstep for him. To a certain degree, I think that him taking the role of Captain Jack Sparrow in Pirates of the Caribbean, it changed the trajectory of his career. I mean, I think most people would say that, because from what I know about him, he wanted to take on parts. He never wanted to be this big, huge movie star. He didn't want to be widely known. He wanted to take smaller films where it was more unique and not intimate necessarily, but it was just these bizarre little films. He had Edward Scissorhands. It's just a really weird cult film. And he had other things like that. And then he took that and he exploded, and then you have him in these other movies where people just go to see him, just go to see Johnny Depp, because they think, oh, he's going to do these weird things. He's going to make a really unique character, which he does have a history of doing in most movies. So you see that after Pirates of the Caribbean, in things like the new Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, or Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, whatever that movie is called. Can't remember the exact thing. I like Roald Dahl a lot, actually, but I can never remember what the name of that book is, and I'd like to say it correctly, or at least say that I don't know. But yeah, he had these unique things, and he even had a unique character in there, really bizarre character. Then he played that character in seven more movies after that. But you remember Captain Jack Sparrow, and it's the same thing. Think of the movies you love, and there's probably a character you really like in those movies. Since I'm a guy, I lean toward more movies that guys would like, right? But some things here, you have like Dirty Harry. The movie would not be the same without the character. Indiana Jones. the Joker as played by Heath Ledger, because there's so many of them, or the Joker as played by pretty much any Joker. And people didn't like Suicide Squad because of the Joker portrayal. They didn't like the specific type of Joker. I don't think that the actor who played that Joker did a bad job. I think he acted well. I think you believe that he was that character. I just don't think that character was good, unfortunately for him. Jared Leto, that's who the person was. And it goes on and on and on. You have people like, I actually had another idea in my head. You had people like Princess Leia from, I was going to say Lord of the Rings, but it's Star Wars. You have the Hobbits from Lord of the Rings, if we want to go that direction. And there's so many different movies, and if you have a favorite movie, I'm almost certain, and you might be the odd man out, there's probably somebody out there, but if you have a favorite movie, it's likely you have a character who is central to that movie, a very memorable, iconic character in most cases. But if you want to make a character memorable, as far as I see, and I think this is coming from people who have been writing a lot longer than me, have a lot more experience, have twice as much writing experience, more than twice as much, I'm sure, because they're so much older than me, but they have a lot more writing experience from me, and I've kind of taken this in and chewed on it for the past few months, and I think that I agree with it as well. Maybe 2 or 3 months that I've chewed on it. But to make a character memorable, that character needs to fit into the story you're actually telling. The stories, I mean, that have characters that bring out the best in the stories, create the best stories, right? Those are the memorable stories. So you have the character matches the story takes on certain ideas, the story has certain things happening in them. And because of that, the story is better, but also the character matches the story. So the story brings out the best in the character, not necessarily good in the character, but it portrays the character the best way possible. It allows the character to shine through. It allows the character to tell the story that doesn't, I don't know if you'd say needs to be told, but the story that is the best in that situation. And you can do it with any of these, right? If we go back to these characters I mentioned, let's switch it up. Let's just say an Indiana Jones type character in the place of Captain Jack Sparrow. That is going to change the story dramatically. If you take someone like Luke Skywalker and put him in the place of Dirty Harry, that is going to change the story dramatically, because Dirty Harry is he's hardened. He is like the tough guy. He is supposed to be, I don't know if you consider him not world weary, but he's street smart in a way. And Luke Skywalker's the naive farm boy. He's the everyman. And it's a different character archetype, and it's going to change the dynamic of the story completely. You're going to actually change the story because you change that central character, and that's actually what you're doing when you change the central character. It's the character, going back to my original point, or what I was saying at the beginning, not my original point. The character is so vital to the story that if you change the archetype of that character, if you take one character and put it in another, if you put that character in another story, you're going to be changing the story completely. But that's why it's important to find the character that best fits into that story. If you want to think about it in terms of what would you call it? Villains. If you take a Joker type character, right, as portrayed by so many different people, and you place him in Darth Vader's situation, it would be comical. It would be ridiculous if you take Darth Vader and put him in place of the Joker, or a character like Darth Vader, this brooding, dark character who rarely speaks and is no nonsense and isn't laughing all the time. And you pretty much have Batman facing off against the villain Batman as well if you put those two characters against each other, which is going to change things completely. And actually, in the Batman universe, if we want to talk about it in that way, there are characters who are in some ways parallel to the character of Batman, right? There's actually a character who is called Hush who has a parallel life to Batman in a lot of different ways, and I think they're trying to parallel it and show it. They're trying to actually bring out different character traits in the main character of that series by having someone who closely resembles that character. But yeah, so if you take a step back, and you think about characters, just imagine if instead of Luke Skywalker being the hero in Star Wars, we just take another character from that film and we make Han Solo the hero, the central figure in that. Let's just say that Indiana Jones was an idiot instead of a scholar, right? What if he was just someone who was all about action? But if you know that he was a scholar, if you did not see him at the beginning of one of the films teaching and saying, "Oh, he's a professor," you view him differently because of that. And because you understand him as a scholar, you're going to he brings out certain things in the show, in the movie I mean, that aren't brought out if he wasn't. If he was just a tough guy who was uneducated and he didn't have anything but the action, right? If he only was all about action and never about thought, it would come across very differently. And this goes about the same thing. I mean, there's so many films that center around the character. I mean, if you replace Citizen Kane with someone who is slightly more, I guess, not as ambitious, that's going to change the story just a little bit less ambitious. If you replace Citizen Kane with someone who doesn't regret, right? If he looks back toward childhood and he has no regret, that's going to change the story. That's going to change the whole meaning of the story, because at the end of that film, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it, it's been around forever, so you probably should, but at the end of the film, that's the point of the story, that all the things he gained, even though he was so important, he lost the things that were so valuable despite gaining so many other things in his life. It goes to House of Cards too. I really enjoy the beginning of House of Cards, because the hook of House of Cards is unbelievable. It's very, very good. The main character, I don't know if he's the main character now, the Kevin Spacey character in House of Cards is a power-hungry person who is Machiavellian. And if you shifted that just slightly and you made him greedy, which I don't think he's greedy, he's greedy in one sense, power-hungry, but he's not greedy in a sense he just wants money, right? There's actually a line in the show where he actually says that it's not all about money, it's about power. So if he was more greedy than desiring power, if he was all about money instead of power, it would shift how the show worked, even if everything else about him was the same, which could, in some sense, it couldn't be the same, because by shifting his central focus from power to money, you would actually be changing the character completely. Imagine if in The Shining, if the main character in The Shining was not an alcoholic, that would also change the story as well, because in The Shining, the alcohol is central to the character. Actually, the story of the character pivots on the fact that he's slowly drinking more and more. So because he's an alcoholic, he's an alcoholic, and what goes on is as he drinks, as he slips back into the alcoholism, he goes insane, and he starts to see all the ghosts. He starts to notice everything in the mansion. He notices that the mansion is haunted, and in the story itself, another spoiler alert, but in the story itself, to a certain degree, it's a spoiler alert. In the story itself, you don't know if he is actually seeing things and everything's going on, or if it's just in his head, if he's just going insane, if it's just because of that alcohol. To a certain degree, it's like, yes, this is the case, but at the same time, it's like, it might just be him devolving. It might just be him going mad. But not every character fits into every story, and not every character fits into every story, because if you stick that character in that story, it shifts the story to something else. So it's necessarily the case that not every character fits in a central role in that story. There's other roles that character could fit into. Like I said before, if you took Luke Skywalker and you replaced him with Han Solo, the story would be different, but Han Solo exists in that world. He exists in that story, but he's just not the central figure. He's not the person we're following. He's not the person we are supposed to empathize with the most. Not every character... And to go on about this a little bit more, you might ask, okay, can you explain that a little bit more, why not every character fits into every story? It goes back to my original point. The story is about the character, and to explain it a bit more, the story exists. The story does not exist without a character, at the very least one. And this character doesn't have to be human. The character doesn't have to be conscious to a certain degree. The character, well, it has to be represented in a conscious way to a certain degree, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a conscious thing. It could be, well, in terms of Toy Story, you have toys, but I guess they function as humans. But it doesn't actually exist without a character. If you take out the character, you don't have that change in the character. In the past, I've had conversations and I've heard people who are like, okay, you know, the most important part of the story is you have the structure, you know, you have the shape of the story. So Kurt Vonnegut has his famous, I'm just going to draw it. Kurt Vonnegut has his famous, this is probably going to be backwards though. His famous thing, he has his story structure. So he has this idea of a man in a hole, and I'm just going to show you it. So he has this idea of a man in a hole where you start out and you're really, really low, and the character slowly builds himself out of a hole. And then there's other things like the character starts really high, there's a catastrophe, and then the character builds himself out of that catastrophe. So I think that some people think, oh, if I put together a story and I have those pieces, you know, I know how a story is supposed to move. If you look at certain genres actually have specific formats, right? Certain things, excuse me about that, certain things are supposed to happen at certain points. I've been looking into thrillers and how thrillers are structured, because I'm writing something that's going to, I don't know if it's going to be a thriller necessarily, but it's going to parallel it. It's going to take elements from it. It might not be necessarily considered a thriller, but there's certain points that certain things happen. You can actually look it up, and people have outlined it, and that's how people write thrillers, and that's why in movies, thrillers feel similar, because things happen even at the same time. They happen at the same point in the film when you watch those or you read the books, and you're like, oh, like these seem to all be the same. And I think people run into this thing where they're like, you know, I'm just going to do this, and I'm going to have my my structure. I'm going to build off of that, and then I'm going to, once I get to that point, you know, I can write this, and it's not going to be that difficult. So they approach it from that perspective, and what I'm saying is that you actually, like, you don't have to start with the characters. I think that you need the characters, but you don't have to start with the characters. But when you look at the story structure, you don't realize that story structure exists within the character in a sense, right? There's this idea that, you know, you have themes in a book, you have themes in literature, and you're like, oh, there's this specific theme that runs through this whole entire book. This specific theme is like a thread running through the entire book. But what is that? There's another thread running through the entire book. It's the thread of the character, and it's more like the binding of a book. You know, if you don't have the book bound, the pages are going to go everywhere. So think of the characters as the binding of a book. The book couldn't exist. Actually, it wouldn't be a book without binding, because it would just be loose pages. You know, a book means that there's binding. A book means that someone has taken the time, or a machine has been manufactured to bind that book together. And that's what the character does. The character, it's not just this person. It's not just someone acting in the world of the book. Though it seems that way. The character, in a sense, is the world of the book. The character, in a sense, is bigger than the book. And the book exists within that character. Some people might, it's more of an analogy, right? When you read the book, the character exists within the book, but the story is told through the character. That's what I'm trying to say. The story is told through the character. You start at one point, and you see through the eyes of that character, or another character, right? You need characters, you look through their eyes, and the story is told in that way. It's a very, to a certain degree, it's very human in a way, because if you want to tell a story, you have to understand people. Or if you want to tell a good story, you can tell a story that's not very good. But if you want to tell a story, you have to understand people, and you have to look through the eyes of the character. You can't disregard the character in that sense. And going back to this idea about the fact that you need to choose the right character, certain characters, you can look at story structures. You can look at like, how would I do this? What kind of characters do I need in this story? I actually like to look at it a little differently. I do try to take into account all the different aspects, but when I look at a story, I like to think about the central idea of the story, and I think about what's happening, and I think about, and I have a hard time sometimes with this, and I haven't done this as much in the past, but I've shifted more toward it as I've gotten older, and I think better at writing as well. But you look at the story, and you look at the premise, you look at the conclusion, and you're like, well, who is the person who fits in this story? So, for example, I have a story, and I was like, maybe I should start with a really naive character, and I should have a friend of the character be not so naive, and kind of like, I guess, like they're more street smart, and they get into more trouble, and they're more willing to get into trouble, and they're more free about stuff. And I kept thinking about that. I'm like, man, how am I going to make this character work? And I flipped the characters. It was really bad. I flipped the characters, and it worked. It clicked together. It's like, yeah, that makes so much sense because this is the ending, right? I know where the character is going to be going. I know where the character's ending. I know the end result. I know how the character is going to change. And I think that the best, it's easier to write a story if you know where the ending is going. It's easier to write a story when you say, oh, this is how the character starts and this is how the character ends. And I think that people, when they look at a story, when they read, or when they're starting to write a story, they could be like, well, this is the typical character that fits into this story, right? So if you're writing a fantasy, and you could be like, well, I need an everyman. That's going to be the start. That's going to be the central character. That everyman turns into the hero. That everyman's going to go through the hero's journey. That everyman is going to be representation of everyone, and they're going to overcome, and there's going to be certain plot points they fit into. But I think we can go further. I think we can go further with our characters. I think we can think about, okay, what are the flaws in the characters? Who are they? What is their central idea that motivates them? Because if you know who the characters are, and I think that some people do this a lot better than me, and some people, I'll get to that in a second. Some people do this better than me, but if you don't know what the central ideas of the character are, right? What are their basic ideas? There's a foundation of ideas everybody has. That's just how it is. And your foundation might be that nobody has a foundation of ideas, or a foundation of ideas is stupid. That's still a foundation of ideas that you build off of. So you're contradicting yourself. But everybody has a basic ideas they build stuff off of, and then those ideas, they naturally, in some logical sense, maybe not perfect logic, maybe not good logic, they move toward other ideas. They make conclusions about life, they make conclusions about the world because of the ideas they start from. And if you know the central ideas of your character, you can build the other ideas of your character. And then you can be like, well, this person is a nihilist, right? If your character's a nihilist, you are going to approach that story in a much different way than if your character actually thinks there's meaning in the world. If your character thinks the world is brutality, if they think the human species is unbelievably flawed and it's going to ultimately lead to evil and destruction, that character is going to function very differently in the world, and that story is going to be very different. If the character thinks that humans are naturally good, if the character thinks that humans are inherently good, that character is going to function differently in the story. That character is going to change how the story works. And this applies to, I like to get down to the very basic ideas because I think it has the most profound impact on the story, but it also applies to smaller things. If the character, I don't like to bring in contemporary politics into writing. I think it's annoying, and I think it tends to get too much into, it tends to reflect your ideas too much, my ideas too much, right? The person tends to be like more ideological, and they tend to be like, well, this has to match up exactly with what I think, and it might be the case that the world doesn't match up exactly with what you think, and your vision and your ideas are being clouded because of the fact that you have these specific ideas. Either side or multiple sides, whichever party, whichever side of each debate you line up on, or if there's a multitude of sides to that debate, whatever you line up on. If you talk about stuff that's currently happening, you often get clouded. It's really difficult to cut through that, so I don't like to do that. But you could have politics in there as well. I mean, I think people do this really well in terms of like fantasy or science fiction, I think people do this really well. You have people like Frank Herbert who make a very sophisticated world, who make a very sophisticated political systems, who have multiple different factions who are maybe vying for power, but all of them have different motivations. That's another thing we use, right? When you go into a story, people are like, what's your character's motivation? And I don't remember who said it, but they're like, yeah, your character should have a motivation. Every single time you're writing, every single time you're putting words down, your character should want something, right? Even if that's a glass of water, which I need right now. Your character should want something, even if that's a glass of water. But I'm actually saying, I think what I'm saying is go even deeper. You're not just looking for the character motivation. You're looking for the character's basic assumptions, because then you can understand how they look at the world, then you can build that motivation off in a very logical way. And there's going to be other things, other ideas, other ways, other situations you're going to be able to deal with because that character has specific basic ideas. And going back to another episode I talked about straw men. I don't think you should ever try to. So if you disagree with your character, you should give your character the best possible argument you can for being who they are, right? When I have characters I disagree with wildly that I write, and I still have fun. I think I still like the characters, but I try not to create a straw man. I try not to make them stupid. I try not to make them come to easy conclusions, right? They actually struggle with ideas. They go through the process. They're not just saying stuff, right? If you read my characters, you think they're just saying stuff. I don't try to approach it like that. I don't try to be like, oh, they're just going to say this because, that's how they think, and I think this idea is stupid. I'm actually trying to give that idea I'm trying to say this is why people think that idea. It's not just saying that, oh, people say this because they're dumb. It's like, no, people say this because they're actually sincere about what they're saying. They're not just saying it. They look at the world and they see the world as in this way, and there's a reason for them seeing it in this way. So I think that when you approach characters, you need to be careful not to, if you disagree with the ideas of the characters. And this is another reason why politics gets really difficult to deal with current politics if you're talking about characters, or if you're writing a character, is because it's harder to step back and give that character its say. It's harder to allow that character to speak or think or not become a parody or not become a straw man when you're writing it. So you need to be like, okay, who is this character? And let the character speak and actually like the character. And you kind of not have a conversation with the character, but you allow the character to be a full fleshed out human, or a full fleshed out person who has their own thoughts, who isn't stupid. But now I'm getting off track for what I was talking about. But the basic assumptions will allow you to get to that point. The basic assumptions will allow you to look at a character, and then you can study those basic assumptions. You can study why people have those basic assumptions. You can actually walk yourself through the logic of those assumptions. You can defend it. I think it's important, even if you disagree with it, to figure out why people defend those assumptions, to actually empathize, or I guess sympathize with those assumptions, and be like, well, people think it because of this. My character thinks it because of this. I don't hate my character. I don't think they're an idiot. I actually say, oh, you have a good reason for understanding this. But it goes beyond motivation, because your motivation is affected by your basic assumption, right? If you think that the world should be fair, right, that is a basic assumption. You have a motivation in different situations to make the world fair, but it might not be the case that you're just looking to make the world fair in every single situation. But that'll tint how you look at the world. That'll tint how you function in the world. That'll tint how your characters function in the story. And I think that it's more about taking a step beyond it. I think that building a character means starting with those assumptions and then going, okay, what does the character think about these different things? It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to use all those ideas, but it does help you flesh out the character and understand who the character is. And in the past, I've done it where I didn't figure out who the character was until I wrote the book. But at the same time, at some point you do figure it out, and it's okay to write a first draft or even go through the editing process and figure out the character. But if you figure out the character early, it might save you a headache later on, because you might get to the end of a book and you might be like, well, I have no idea who this character is, so everything's a mess. I don't know what to do with this character or where to go from here. You might get there, and you might get to the point where you're like, well, I actually have to rewrite this whole thing, which isn't necessarily the worst thing. I have one thing to say extra, and then I have one more thing to say in relation to characters. Some people try to figure out all the little tiny details of their characters. It's like, oh, does your character like coffee or tea? I don't see the point in this, right? It can flesh out the character to a certain degree depending, right? But I'll explain that in a second. The relevance of whether someone likes coffee or tea doesn't matter in a book, unless you're in like a crime or a mystery where you have to figure out, oh, this person likes coffee or tea, therefore, they're the killer. So it could matter depending on that, but there are certain situations where it does. But in terms of a character affecting a story, right? Doesn't matter if Indiana Jones likes coffee or tea. Does that affect the story in any way? I don't think it does. Doesn't matter if he is, well, I don't know if he eats meat in the movie. Doesn't matter if he likes a certain type of shoe. Doesn't matter if he plays tennis. Doesn't matter if he golfs, right? It does, like I said before, it does matter that he's a scholar, but that is because it actually gets down to more basic ideas. He thinks education's important, right? He didn't just learn it on the fly. He isn't just a treasure hunter, right? There's also that line in Indiana Jones, I don't remember which one of the movies it is, where he says, that belongs in a museum. He isn't just out for the gold. He isn't just out for the adventure either. He's out because he values the past. He wants to remember the past. And we see that reflected in him being a scholar, right? Certain things in the movie, it's like, oh, he likes his hat and he has a whip. He brings a whip and he wears specific clothes, and that helps create the character. And I don't know if that probably changes how we view the character because of the fact that it presents a specific type of person to the viewer, right? If he wore a top hat, which it would kind of be absurd actually, but he wears a specific type of hat because we have specific ideas about the clothes he wears, right? He wears those clothes because we as a society view those clothes in a specific way. We understand them emotionally in a specific way. Therefore, we're going to place those assumptions on the character. That's why they chose those clothes. And if you have a character who's really hyperactive, it might be important to give him a coffee cup, but that's different. That's beyond it. So if we look at the different little details of a character, what we need to ask ourselves is, does it matter within the story if I know this? And if it doesn't matter in the story, if you know that little piece of trivia about the character, then we don't need to develop the character in that way. And this is why I actually think that you can shortcut your thinking, and you don't have to go through the process of thinking through every little detail of the character if you start with basic ideas. Because like I said, those basic ideas affect bigger ideas, other ideas that come up. So it's like if they put the foundation down, they have these ideas they have, and they build on top of these ideas, and you can take the basic ideas of the character and then a few different layers above, and you can actually extrapolate to other things the character is doing based on these ideas. So you actually have to do less thinking. Maybe not less thinking, maybe you do more thinking, but once you get those basic ideas down, it's going to be easier to be like, oh, this character would, let's just say the character really values being healthy, right? So think about how many things that are going to affect that character. But let's even go even further. The character thinks you should live the best possible life you can. Therefore, the character thinks you should be healthy. If the character thinks you should live the best possible life you can, and you should meaning that you should use every moment of your life in a way that is good and healthy, and you should be like a full human being essentially. That's going to affect so many different things, right? And the character, you could take that in so many different directions. The character could think, oh, because I think this, I'm going to run after pleasure. I'm going to just do what's pleasurable. Or the character could think, oh, I'm going to be very disciplined. I'm going to be very healthy. And because the character is very healthy, the character doesn't eat certain things. The character doesn't drink alcohol. The character doesn't smoke, right? A character could be really hopeful. The character's underlying ideas could be one of hope, and that's going to affect the character in profound ways. The character is going to talk differently because of that. But going back to the idea of the character being healthy, the character might not drink coffee because the character wants to be healthier, right? Might think, oh, that's not a good thing. So these basic assumptions, the basic assumption of the character wanting to live a full life and use the time as well as possible, jumps up to the healthiness. And then it jumps up to don't drink coffee, which, again, if it isn't relevant to the story, you probably don't need to put it in. There is a certain relevance of allowing the people to see. You put certain details in so that people can understand who the character is, but those details should come back to that basic idea. They shouldn't just be random details, right? It should come back to who that character is at their core. The details of a person aren't random. They are connected to what the character thinks, right? If a character doesn't wear a tie, if the character might hate ties because they hate propriety. They might just be like, why should I wear a tie? Because I'm submitting to the man. But the idea of why they don't wear a tie connects back to this idea of they don't like authority, they don't want to submit. And it's kind of like there's a central hub, and there's these things that are they're pulling away, they're floating away from the central hub. There's a planet, and there's these things that are pulling away from the planet because there's no gravity and they're slowly floating away, but they can't get too far away because they're attached by strings, right? They're still attached back to that central hub, and that's what I'm saying. You're not just making stuff up to make stuff up. It's always connecting back to that central hub. It might be a good practice for you, and I don't find it to be a good practice for me. It might be a good practice to find all those little details. I find it a bit of a slog, but at the same time, if it helps you, that's good. But it goes back to that central hub. It's always in service of those central ideas, the core of who that character is. So again, one last thing, and the more I think about it, the more I believe it's true. The most important thing in a story is the character. The character isn't the only thing in a story, but the story is told through the character. So without the character, the story would not be the story. And that's what I'm going to leave you with for this week. Congratulations, you got to the end of my podcast. So you either had to listen to my voice, or you had to listen to my voice and watch my face, which I don't envy you, let's just say that. But if you're someone who likes this podcast and you're thinking, I'd like to support him in this podcast or the other creative things I'm doing, there's a few things you can do, because some people don't know what they can do to support people who create stuff. So these are the few things you can do that will really, really help me. First of all, check out my website, check out the other things I'm doing. Second, comment on things, share them, like them, subscribe if you haven't already. And the third thing you can do is give reviews on different places. All right. So the biggest thing for this podcast is going on to iTunes, giving it an honest review, telling people why you like it, telling people why you hate my voice, why you hate my face, but telling people why they should really check it out, despite the fact that I have so many failings in terms of looks and voice. Other than that, if you want to check out my books, grab a copy of the book and listen to the serialized novel. Give digital copies away. That's a really big thing too. I always want to give you something that is valuable to you. I always want to give someone listening to this podcast something that's going to stick with them, or a book that they can actually own. And you can own that book for very, very cheap. So go check that out on Amazon. The different things I said: subscribe, upvote, comment, share, and definitely give it a review on iTunes. All right, as always, my name is Daniel Poppie, and this is How to Write Good.